When I saw the advertisement for this house, my heart skipped a beat. The photo, taken on a gloomy day, showed an old mansion with narrow windows and a steep roof. It seemed to me that the house was hiding something. It almost whispered to me, "Choose me." The price was so low it seemed suspicious. The realtor must have noticed my surprise because she quickly explained. The owner was in a hurry to sell. She said it dryly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Still, I wasn't looking for logic. I was looking for a fresh start. My life had been a complete mess lately. After breaking up with Alice and spending months in an apartment with bare walls, I felt I needed a change. Something real. A place where I could piece myself back together. So, I bought the house. On moving day, it rained buckets. The sky seemed heavy, as if a storm was brewing. I got out of the car, looked at the house, and took a deep breath. It looked even more ominous than in the photos. The tall windows seemed like eyes, closely watching my every step. The facade was weathered, with peeling paint exposing gray boards underneath. A broken curtain hung in the attic, slightly swaying in the wind. I felt like a character in a Gothic novel. "It's just a house," I muttered under my breath. The front door opened with a strained creak. Inside it was quiet, too quiet. The air felt stagnant. The living room I entered smelled of dust and dampness. The old wooden parquet was stained and scratched, as if someone had danced in heavy boots here. I spent several hours unpacking boxes and arranging my things. In the kitchen, I found some jars of dried jam, and in the bathroom, an even older mirror with stains that wouldn't wash off. It all gave the impression that the house lived its own life, even when no one was around. By the time I finished, it was already getting dark. I locked the doors and lay down on the sofa, hoping to get some rest. The silence was pleasant. But then a sound came from somewhere deep in the house. A light creak, as if footsteps. I sat up abruptly and froze. Probably just the wind, I thought. But there wasn't a single open window in the house. The next morning, I decided to explore the house. I went up to the attic. The storage was filled with old things, boxes of yellowed letters, children's toys with missing eyes and torn fur, ceramic figurines with cracks. I came across a wooden box. Inside was a diary in a leather cover. Its pages were yellowed, but the text was clear. I opened the first page. "This house is a cage," it read. The following lines were fragments that seemed like ramblings. "He came at night, the whispers won't let me sleep, he wants to take me." I closed the diary and felt a chill run through me. Maybe it was just fiction or the writings of a sick person. But deep down, I knew this house was hiding more than just old furniture and dust. That night, I heard the whisper for the first time. It was like faint breathing right next to my ear. I woke up in a cold sweat, scanning the room. No one. I convinced myself it was a dream, but when I went back to sleep, the whisper returned. This time, the words were clearer. "You're not alone." In the morning, I inspected the house again, searching for something that could explain the sound. But I found nothing. The diary became my only source of information. I started reading it page by page, trying to find any answers. The entries grew increasingly disturbing. "The walls are watching. I heard him behind the door. He knows I'm here." The words stirred my thoughts. Who was he? And was it connected to the whisper I'd heard? The last entry in the diary truly unsettled me. "I can't take it anymore. He took me." I put the diary back in the box and returned to my room. I had the distinct feeling that someone was watching me, even though I was alone in the house. My hands trembled. Was I also starting to lose my mind, like the previous owner? The silence of the night became almost unbearable. It seemed to press down on me. I fell asleep with the lamp on all night. But the whisper returned, and this time it felt even closer. The words weren't clear, but the meaning was, I could no longer ignore that this house had a life of its own. After the first night with the whisper, I realized this house had its own rules. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. But it was just an old house, I told myself. Old houses creak, groan, breathe. I didn't want to admit, even to myself, that I was scared. I decided to spend more time outside the house. Walks around town seemed like a good idea, and even better would be meeting new people. The locals seemed friendly at first glance, but that changed when I mentioned where I lived. One man sitting in a cafe hid behind his newspaper. An elderly woman selling pies at the market frowned and asked, "Did you buy that house?" "Yes," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "Do you know anything about it?" "All I know is, I'd stay far away from it," she said, turning away. Disheartened, I decided to head home. But this brief interaction left me with more questions than answers. What did they know that I didn't? Evening came quickly, and once again, I was alone in the house. The rooms felt darker than they had before. Even the electricity seemed different in this place. The lights flickered like candles in the wind, and the corners of the rooms seemed cloaked in thicker shadows. My thoughts kept drifting back to the diary. Soon, I heard the same whisper again. At first, it was barely audible. It seemed like nothing more than the sound of wind seeping through cracks. But it grew clearer. It sounded as if it was coming from several rooms at once. I tried to trace its source. In the kitchen, I felt a sudden gust of cold air. There were no open windows. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the next room. "Who's there?" I shouted. No response, just the persistent whisper, mocking me. Panic began to set in. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to walk to the room where the sound had come from. It was the living room. The light barely illuminated the space. In the middle of the floor lay a book that had fallen from the shelf. I didn't remember it being there. I picked it up. It was a thick, old book with a battered cover. It smelled of dampness and mold. Opening it, I saw it was some kind of religious text with strange annotations in the margins. There were symbols drawn there that reminded me of ones I'd seen in the basement. I wanted to slam it shut and throw it away, but instead, I left it on the table. It felt like the right thing to do, though I didn't know why. The next day, I decided to go back down to the basement. Thoughts swirled in my mind. If this place truly held something sinister, perhaps I'd find more clues there. I took a flashlight and carefully descended the creaky stairs. The basement was colder than before. I could see my breath in the air. New symbols had appeared on the walls, ones I was sure weren't there before. They looked fresh, though no one else could have painted them. I was alone. Among the chaotic lines, a jagged inscription stood out. "The shadow is near." My heart pounded like a drum. The flashlight began to flicker. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. Suddenly, I heard voices. Not one, but many. They weren't just whispering, they were singing. A strange, monotonous chant filled the room. I dropped the flashlight and bolted up the stairs, nearly tripping on the last step. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt like a trapped animal, constantly straining to hear any sound. Now I knew for certain, the whisper was real. Whatever it was, it had grown stronger. It wanted me to stay, yet it also sought to terrify me to the brink. I sat on the bed, clutching the flashlight, rereading the entries in the diary. One passage stood out. "He will come when you are at your weakest." Those words terrified me more than I wanted to admit. Who was he? And what did weakest mean? The next day, I met my neighbor, a gray-haired man with thick eyebrows named Henry. He looked at me as if he knew something important but didn't want to share it. "How are you finding the house?" he asked, not out of politeness but with a hint of concern. I sighed. "To be honest, it's pretty unsettling," I replied. "Do you know anything about the place?" Henry stared at me for a long time before answering. "I know that house has taken many people. It's not meant for the living. If you're smart, you'll leave and never look back." "What do you mean? Taken who?" He turned and walked away, leaving me with even more questions. That evening, the whisper returned, but this time it was different. It sounded like it was saying my name. "Alex." The voice was soft but distinct. It came from the hallway outside my room. With the flashlight in hand, I gathered my courage and opened the door. The door creaked slowly as I pushed it open. The hallway was dark, and only the beam of the flashlight illuminated the walls. The whisper stopped. But I knew it was still there. And then I saw it. On the floor in front of me was a shadow. It didn't belong to me or anything around it. It simply existed. And as I stared at it, it moved. I felt as if I were losing my balance. The shadow slowly crept toward me. I stumbled back into the room and slammed the door. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. He's here, I thought. And now it was only a matter of time. The next morning, I woke up feeling an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. It wasn't just fear, it was the overwhelming sense of helplessness. I decided that this couldn't go on. If the house held secrets, I had to uncover them. The day began with a desperate search for answers. I went to the local library, a gloomy yet cozy place. Behind the registration desk sat a stern-looking woman in her 60s, her glasses glinting like two tiny mirrors. "I need information about a house in town," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up and frowned slightly. "Which house?" "The old mansion on the outskirts," I replied, hesitating. Her expression changed. She froze as though I'd said something dreadful. Then, without a word, she pointed to one of the shelves. "Look in the local archive. There should be something there." Her words were curt, but I could tell she knew more than she was willing to share. I found some old newspaper clippings and documents. The first mentions of the house dated back to the late 19th century. It was built by a man named Jedediah Morrison, known in town as a skilled craftsman. The articles described him as a man who was not afraid of the dark. That phrase unsettled me. Then I found a mention of his death. It had occurred under mysterious circumstances. Morrison was found in the basement of his house with deep cuts on his arms and strange symbols carved into his chest. Newspapers speculated it was suicide, but one local resident called it a sacrifice. My chest tightened as I read those words. If Morrison had indeed performed some ritual, what was he trying to summon? And more importantly, had he succeeded? When I returned home, I went back down to the basement. The icy atmosphere was the same. The symbols on the walls seemed even brighter, as if someone had recently repainted them. I carefully examined the walls and floor, searching for something I'd missed before. On one of the stones, I found a thin crack. It looked like the stone could be removed. I tugged at it and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in old, torn paper. Inside were more of Morrison's writings. They looked like a diary, written in a trembling hand. "The entity is near. It demands more. Its voice is a whisper that pierces the soul. I cannot sleep. I cannot think. It wants my life, but will one be enough?" I dropped the notebook as if it had burned my hands. The meaning of those words was clear. Morrison had been trying to do more than build a house. He had been trying to summon something, and that something had remained here. I decided to talk to someone who knew more about this place. The only person who might help was old Henry. His words still echoed in my mind. "The house has taken many." I found him in a small cafe near the town square. He was sitting in the corner with a cup of coffee, staring at the table. When I approached, he looked up at me. "I knew you'd be back," he said, and I realized he had been expecting me. "What do you know about the house?" I asked. "I found Morrison's writings. They're terrifying." Henry was silent for a long time. Then he gestured for me to sit. "Morrison wasn't just a craftsman," he began. "He was dabbling with forces he didn't understand. They say he was searching for immortality, trying to leave his mark on the world. But instead, he called forth something he couldn't control." "What did he summon?" I asked. "An entity," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's bound to the house. It feeds on fear, pain, and souls. Anyone who steps into that house becomes its prey." I felt my blood run cold. "And what do I do?" I asked, my voice breaking. Henry looked at me gravely. "I can help you. But it's dangerous. If you want to survive, we'll need to perform a ritual. But be prepared, it won't be easy." When I returned home, I felt that something in the house had changed. The silence was no longer the same. I felt its presence everywhere, in the creak of the floorboards, in the movement of the air, in the hollow echo of my footsteps. The whispering began earlier than usual that evening. This time, it wasn't calm. It sounded like countless voices screaming at once. There were too many of them, and they were too close. I felt them invading my mind, splitting it apart. For a moment, I thought about running. But no matter where I went, it would follow me. I knew that. The entity was already a part of me, and now there was only one way out: to fight. The next day, I met Henry again. He brought with him a book, old and battered, looking as though it had existed for centuries. "This is your chance," he said. "But I warn you, if you falter during the ritual, you'll become part of that house forever." His words were harsh, but I knew I had no other choice. Returning home after meeting Henry, I no longer felt like an ordinary person. It seemed as though the house could now see right through me, and its entity was aware of my intentions. The darkness had grown thicker, and the whispering more intense. I could hear it even during the day. It followed me, making me glance over my shoulder constantly. I decided to descend into the basement once more, hoping to uncover more clues. The entrance to the basement felt almost alive. The door, which usually opened easily, was now stuck. I had to exert considerable effort to open it. When I finally managed, I was greeted by a wave of cold air that made me shiver. This was no natural cold, it was something else. The stairs creaked louder than before. Each step echoed ominously through the depths of the house. The air carried a strange scent, something between damp earth and ash. I held my flashlight tightly, but its beams seemed pale, almost swallowed by the darkness. New symbols had appeared on the basement walls, etched deep with an extraordinary force. I recognized them from the books Henry had shown me the day before, marks used in rituals to summon or contain entities. But why were they here? Then I saw it. On one of the walls, clear and unmistakable, was written, "He has come." My heart stopped. The writing looked fresh, but I was certain no one else had been here. My fingers went numb, and my legs felt like jelly. The walls seemed to close in around me, as though trying to swallow me whole. "Who are you?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. And then, the whisper responded. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a multitude of voices, it was one. Deep, guttural, almost inhuman. "I am here. I have always been here." My flashlight flickered, and its light went out. Darkness enveloped me completely. I froze, barely breathing. My heart pounded so hard it felt as though its echoes filled the basement. I could hear it, the entity. It was moving, drawing closer. Suddenly, something cold touched my shoulder. I screamed, leaped back, and fell, hitting the stone floor. The flashlight blinked back on, revealing only empty space before me. Nothing was there. But that didn't mean I was alone. I scrambled out of the basement, trying to calm myself. I locked the door behind me, though I knew it was futile. The entity didn't need doors to enter. It was already inside. That night, the whispering returned. It was closer, clearer. The voice called my name, plucking at my nerves like a bow on a violin string. But now, I understood its words. They had become more distinct. "Alex, you cannot escape." I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voice echoed inside my head. It sounded like both a warning and a threat. "You cannot run. You are mine." I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing against the bedroom wall. Cold sweat dripped down my face. My heart raced as though it would burst from my chest. That's when I decided to act. At dawn, I met Henry at his home. His eyes looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. He immediately understood what had happened. "The entity is growing stronger," he said before I could speak. "You don't have much time." "Then tell me what to do," I replied. "You mentioned a ritual. We have to do it, or I'll lose my mind." Henry nodded and invited me into his house. On the table lay a large, old book with a worn cover. It looked as though it had belonged to someone who knew far too much about the supernatural. "This isn't just a ritual," Henry explained. "It's a battle. You have to be ready. If you hesitate or break, it will consume you." His words were cold but true. I nodded, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Henry continued, "We'll need symbols to contain it. Salt to create a barrier. And your will to survive, that's the most important thing." We began gathering everything we needed: salt, candles, chalk for drawing the symbols. Henry warned me that the ritual could last hours and that the entity would try to break me in every way possible. "It will show you your deepest fears," he said. "It knows what you're afraid of." When I returned to the house, night had already fallen. I entered carrying the items for the ritual. The air inside the house was heavy, oppressive. Breathing felt like a struggle. The whispering was incessant now, playing even when I tried to ignore it. It had become a maddening cacophony of voices merging into one horrifying sound. I sat in the living room, surveying the empty space, and closed my eyes. All I could do was wait. Tomorrow, we would perform the ritual. And then I would learn whether I could destroy this entity, or become just another victim of the house. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The house was cloaked in an unsettling silence. Even the whispering that had haunted me for days seemed to have stilled. But this only made the atmosphere more unnerving. The uncertainty pushed me into action, and I decided to meet with Henry to learn more about the ritual and what lay ahead. Henry awaited me in his small cabin. The space was cluttered with old books, candles, and peculiar objects that seemed to belong to another era. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and wax. He gestured for me to sit. "Are you ready?" he asked without looking at me. "I don't know if anyone can ever be ready for this," I replied honestly. "But I don't see any other choice." Henry nodded, as if he understood. He began speaking in a calm, measured tone, like someone who had recited these words many times before. "Jedediah Morrison wasn't just a craftsman," he began. "He was what people might call an alchemist, or some even said a sorcerer. But he wasn't a master of magic. He was an amateur who dabbled with forces he didn't understand." Henry picked up an old book, opened it, and showed me a page filled with writings and symbols, the same ones I had seen in the basement. "These are summoning marks," he explained. "They're used to open a portal between our world and the world of darkness. Morrison wanted to summon an entity that, in his mind, could grant him power and immortality." "And what went wrong?" I asked, a cold knot forming in my chest. "Everything," Henry said, looking me square in the eye. "The entity escaped his control. It didn't become his servant but instead bound itself to the house, turning it into a trap for souls." Henry took a breath before continuing. "People began disappearing. Everyone who lived in that house either went mad or vanished without a trace. The authorities wrote it off as natural causes, but those who stayed in town knew the truth. They saw shadows in the windows, heard voices coming from the ground. My head spun as I tried to piece together everything I'd heard. What is this entity? What does it want?" Henry shook his head. "It's not that simple to explain. It's not a ghost or a demon in the traditional sense. It's something beyond human comprehension. It feeds on fear, pain, and life itself. It's darkness given form." His words made me wonder how one could fight something that had no form, something that fed on the struggle itself. "You said we could stop it. How?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Henry pulled out another book and showed me a detailed ritual written on its yellowed pages. "We'll create a barrier," he explained. "These symbols will contain it if we draw them correctly. Then, we'll use fire to sever its connection to the house. But know this, it won't go down without a fight." He carefully walked me through the steps of the ritual, how to arrange the symbols, how to maintain focus during the process. Henry warned me of the dangers. "It will try to invade your mind," he said. "It will show you your fears, your greatest weaknesses. If you give in, you'll become its next victim." I nodded, though the fear gripping me felt insurmountable. The rest of the day was spent preparing for the ritual. We gathered everything we needed: salt, candles, chalk, and knives to carve the symbols. It all felt like a scene from a film about the occult, but I couldn't afford to doubt. This was my only chance. Before I left, Henry gave me one final piece of advice. Tomorrow night we begin. But tonight you must rest. Save your strength. And remember, don't trust what you see or hear. It's a master of illusions. When I returned home, I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Every whisper, every sound in the house seemed louder than ever before. I constantly felt as though I were being watched. My thoughts tangled into knots. What if the ritual didn't work? What if it had already won? Late at night, I heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind. But the knock came again, louder this time. My heart raced as I approached the door, flashlight in hand. "Who's there?" I shouted, but there was no response. Slowly, I opened the door. No one was there. But on the doorstep, I saw something written in chalk. "You're next." That night, I knew there was no turning back. Tomorrow, I would learn who would win, me or the entity. The day had come. I woke earlier than usual, though I had only slept in fragments, haunted by nightmares. The house was eerily silent, unnervingly so. It felt as though its very essence was waiting to see what I would do next. Henry arrived at 10 in the morning, carrying a heavy bag filled with everything we need. His face was pale but resolute. "We don't have much time," he said without even greeting me. "We need to have everything ready before sunset." He quickly spread the contents of his bag across the kitchen table: candles, salt, a carved knife, chalk, and several small glass bottles filled with dark liquid. One of the bottles immediately caught my eye. It glowed faintly with a reddish light. "What's this?" I asked, pointing to it. "Animal blood," Henry replied without looking up. "It's needed to activate the symbols. Don't ask questions if you want to survive." The preparations began with creating a barrier. We spread salt along the perimeter of the house, forming an unbroken circle. Henry explained that it would help contain the entity within the house and prevent it from spreading further. "But remember," he warned, "if the barrier is broken, we're all dead. The entity will escape, and no one will be able to stop it." The next step was drawing the symbols. I helped Henry inscribe them on the walls and doors of every room. The symbols were intricate, a blend of runes and geometric shapes. They looked ancient, belonging to a reality far removed from our own. When we finished, I felt the air in the house change. It grew heavier, almost tangible. Breathing became difficult. At noon, Henry instructed me to prepare the room where the ritual would take place. We chose the living room, as it was the largest space in the house. Candles were arranged in a circle, and in the center, we carved a symbol into the floor with the knife. Its grooves were filled with the same reddish liquid from the glowing bottle. "This is the center of power," Henry explained. "The entity will be drawn here. You must be ready. It will try to scare you, to confuse you. But no matter what happens, do not step outside this circle." His words made me pause. What if I couldn't handle it? What if the fear overwhelmed me? After lunch, we made the final preparations. Henry went over the instructions again, and I tried to memorize every movement and word he spoke. "We start at sunset," he said. "The entity is strongest in the dark, but that's also our chance. It will be so focused on attacking that we'll have an opening to finish the ritual." I nodded, though my body trembled. This was more than fear. It was a primal terror, the kind that makes you want to run, even knowing there's nowhere to hide. Just before the ritual, Henry turned to me. "I need to warn you, Alex. If something goes wrong, if we fail to complete the ritual, you'll be stuck here forever. It will take you, and no one will be able to save you." His words pierced through me, but I summoned every ounce of willpower I had and replied, "I'm ready." The sun set, and darkness enveloped the house. We lit the candles, their soft flickering casting eerie shadows across the room. The air felt thicker than ever, and the silence was suffocating. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, anticipating what was to come. Henry stood in the center of the circle and began chanting. His voice was steady and firm, though I noticed a faint tremor in his hands. The symbols on the floor began to glow red, responding to his words as though alive. Suddenly, the whispering began. It was unlike anything I'd heard before, deeper, stronger. The whispers grew louder, morphing into screams. Shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, taking on shapes. "Don't look at them!" Henry shouted, his chanting uninterrupted. I squinted my eyes shut, but out of the corner of my vision, I saw one of the shadows moving closer. It resembled a human figure, but it had no face. Its hand reached toward me, and I felt a cold dread crawl down my spine. "Focus!" Henry yelled again. "It's trying to break you." I forced myself to concentrate, drawing on every shred of resolve I had. The shadows circled the barrier but couldn't penetrate it. Henry's voice grew louder, overpowering the whispers and screams. Then, something shifted. The air grew colder, and the shadows merged into one massive, writhing form that began to advance toward us. It had no defined shape, but it radiated pure malice. I could feel its hatred, its desire to annihilate us. "That's it," Henry whispered. "The entity. This is the critical moment. Don't look away, and don't move." My heart pounded so violently it felt like it would burst. My breaths were shallow, my entire body trembling. There was no room for doubt now, only the hope that we could finish the ritual before it consumed us. The candlelight flickered wildly, casting eerie, distorted shadows across the walls. Henry stood in the center of the circle, his voice rising and falling like the tides in a storm. He recited ancient words, their meaning lost to me, each syllable cutting through the oppressive air and leaving behind a strange, lingering echo. It felt as though the house itself had come alive. The walls creaked faintly, the floor vibrated beneath us, and the whispering had grown so loud it drowned out my own thoughts. Then, the entity fully revealed itself. The swirling darkness coalesced into a single form, a massive, shifting shadow that seemed to breathe and writhe with life. It lacked clear features, but its eyes, or what passed for eyes, glowed a malevolent blood red. "She's here," Henry said, his gaze fixed on the shadow. "Remember, don't give in. She'll try to break your will." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to suppress the fear that clawed at my mind. But her presence was overwhelming. It pierced every part of me, my body, my thoughts, my very memories. This wasn't just evil. It was something beyond comprehension. The entity began to move, extending one of its shadowy limbs toward the circle, only to halt abruptly as if repelled by the barrier. The salt and symbols held it at bay, but I could see it testing the perimeter, probing for a weakness. "Finish the symbols!" Henry shouted, nodding toward the circle. I grabbed the knife and began carving the final lines. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to work quickly and precisely. The darkness drew closer, and I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. Then I heard it. Her voice. "Alex," the entity whispered, the sound like icy needles piercing my skin. I froze, the knife hovering over the unfinished symbol. The voice was unmistakable. It was my mother's. She had died years ago, but the sound was so familiar, so achingly real. "Why did you leave me, Alex?" the entity continued. Her voice quivered with pain. "That's not her," Henry snapped, his sharp gaze cutting through the fog in my mind. "She's lying. Keep going." But I couldn't move. My hand faltered. The voice was so real, so heartbreakingly familiar, that I couldn't ignore it. "You've always been afraid," the entity murmured. "You couldn't save me then, and you won't save yourself now." "That's not true," I shouted, trying to push the voice from my mind. The darkness seemed to sense my weakness. It pressed harder, forcing me to relive my worst memories. I saw myself as a child, standing helplessly by my mother's hospital bed. I saw Alice walking away, her words echoing in my mind. "You're too weak." My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor. "Alex!" Henry's voice cut through the fog like a blade. "Get up! She's trying to break you." Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself to my feet. Gripping the knife tightly, I finished carving the symbol. The moment it was complete, the darkness recoiled, as though struck by an invisible force. "Good," Henry said, his voice steady as he moved on to the next phase. "Now we finish this." Henry uncorked one of the glass bottles and began pouring its contents along the symbols. The liquid hissed and bubbled as it touched the floor, releasing a pungent, acrid smell. He resumed his chanting, the ancient words growing louder and more forceful. I watched as the entity became more frenzied, its shape shifting and writhing violently. The shadows began to solidify. Faces emerged within them, some familiar, others unknown, twisting in agony, screaming, begging for help. These were the souls it had already claimed. "Alex, I see you," the entity hissed. Its voice was now deep, guttural, like a sound dragged from the depths of hell. "You can't win. You're already mine." It reached for me again. The barrier trembled under its assault, cracks forming in the protective circle. "Hold on!" Henry shouted. "We're almost there!" The entity surged toward us with a ferocity that shook the floor beneath our feet. But just as it struck, Henry completed the incantation. The symbols flared with a blinding red light, and the entity let out an ear-splitting scream. This wasn't just a cry of anger, it was the sound of pure agony, of something ancient and malevolent being torn apart. The shadows scattered, retreating back into the corners of the room, and the oppressive darkness began to lift. The house fell silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint crackling of the candles. I realized we were still alive. But it wasn't over. "She'll come back if we don't sever her connection to this place," Henry said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We need to destroy her anchor." I nodded, though my body was trembling with fatigue. We had won the first round, but the decisive battle still lay ahead. The house was silent, but it was a dangerous silence, the kind that comes before a storm. The entity had retreated, but its presence lingered. The air felt thick, charged with an invisible tension. I knew it hadn't truly gone. It couldn't simply disappear, not after everything that had happened. Henry stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily. His face was slick with sweat, his hands trembling. "This isn't over," he said, struggling to steady his breath. "We've freed the house, but its connection to this place hasn't been broken. We need to finish the ritual." I nodded, though my body felt alien to me, drained of strength. Everything I had was spent surviving the entity's attack. But Henry was right. If we didn't finish the ritual, it would return, stronger than before. Henry outlined the final part of the ritual. We had to destroy the symbols binding the entity to the house. It sounded simple, but I knew this would be the most dangerous step yet. "She'll come back," Henry said. "And this time, she won't hold back. She'll use everything she has to stop us." We split up. Henry stayed in the living room to maintain the barrier, while I descended into the basement. My task was to destroy the main symbol carved into the wall, the same one where I had seen the words, "He has come." As I descended the stairs, I felt the darkness wrapping around me, heavy and suffocating. Each step felt harder than the last, as though something invisible was pulling me back. My hands trembled as I held the flashlight. Its beam illuminated the basement, making it appear even more sinister than before. The symbol on the wall glowed faintly with a red, pulsing light, as if it were alive and breathing. I drew the knife and began cutting into its lines. Each stroke felt like a struggle. The blade scraped through the wood, and then the sound changed, like I had pierced something unseen. That's when I heard her voice. "Alex," the entity said. Her voice was low and guttural, yet familiar. "You can't do this." A chill ran down my spine. In the corner of the basement, a shadow began to shift. It took on the form of a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes. It moved toward me, slowly but purposefully. "Alex, look at me," it said, its tone soft, almost caring. "It's me, Mom." I knew it wasn't real. I knew it was an illusion. But I couldn't look away. She looked exactly as she had in my memories, just as I had seen her last before her death. "Why did you leave me, Alex?" she asked, her voice filled with pain. "It's not you," I whispered, trying to muster my will. The entity laughed. Its laughter was cold and metallic, cutting through the air like a blade. "You're weak," it said. "You've always been weak. And now you'll stay here. With me." The basement began to change. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness thickened, and the whispering returned, filling the space. The entity now stood directly before me, its shadowy hand reaching toward me. I screamed and forced myself to keep cutting the symbol. The knife traced its final line, and suddenly, everything shifted. The symbol crumbled like ash, and the entity let out a terrible scream. It was a sound of anguish, rage, and fear all at once. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The darkness clawed at my legs, trying to pull me down, but I broke free and bolted up the stairs. When I returned to the living room, Henry was on his knees, his hands shaking and his face drenched in sweat. He looked up at me and nodded. "You did it," he said weakly. But I couldn't respond. The darkness in the room began to shift again, swirling into a massive vortex at the center. It was the entity, weakened but still alive. "You cannot destroy me," it said, its voice reverberating through the room. "We're not destroying you," Henry replied, his tone firm. "We're sealing you." He pulled out the last bottle and poured its contents into the center of the circle. The candles flared brightly, their light cutting through the darkness. The symbols on the floor glowed fiercely as the vortex began to shrink. The entity screamed, its voice filled with rage and desperation. The shadows lashed out, clawing at the circle, but they couldn't penetrate it. Bit by bit, the darkness was pulled into the symbols, disappearing into the lines etched into the floor. And then, in one final, deafening shriek, the entity vanished. The house fell still. "Is it over?" I asked, barely able to breathe. Henry shook his head. "She can't move anymore," he said, his voice hoarse and weary. "But her presence will remain. You need to leave this house. And never come back." I nodded. This place wasn't my home anymore. It never had been. We left the house at dawn. As we walked away, I turned to look back one last time. In the upstairs window, I saw a shadow. It stood there, watching me. It was the end, but I knew, deep down, that something had stayed behind. Something that would always be watching. We stood on the threshold of the house, our eyes fixed on the windows where faint shadows seemed to drift. Henry was silent, breathing heavily after the ritual. My mind was a storm of relief, fear, and lingering anxiety. The house no longer seemed alive, but its darkness remained buried deep inside. "We're not done yet," Henry said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but resolute. "We need to seal it completely. If we leave even the smallest gap, it will find a way back." "How do we do that?" I asked, though I felt drained of all strength. Henry reached into his bag and pulled out a thick black candle and a small, ancient key. He held up the key, explaining, "This is a magical lock. We'll use it to seal the house. Once it's done, no one will be able to enter again." We re-entered the house. It felt dead, like the aftermath of a storm that had wiped out everything alive. The symbols on the wall still glowed faintly, but their energy was fading. They no longer held the entity. It was now our job to finish the task. Henry moved to the center of the living room where the ritual had taken place. He placed the candle on the floor and lit it. The flame was strange, a deep blue that gave off no warmth. It didn't seem like it belonged to this world. "This candle is the final piece," Henry said. "Its flame will connect our world to her prison. Once it burns out, the connection will be severed for good." I stared at the candle, my heart tightening with fear. It seemed simple, but I knew nothing about this had been easy. The entity wouldn't let us finish without a fight. As the candle burned, the darkness began to stir again. It gathered in the corners of the room, weaving into something like a web. The whispering returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "She's trying to stop us," Henry said. "We have to hold on until the end." The entity began to take shape again. The darkness coalesced into her familiar form, larger and more imposing than before. Her crimson eyes burned with hatred, piercing through the shadows. "You cannot stop me," she said, her voice coming from every direction, as though the house itself were speaking. "We already have," Henry replied, and for the first time, I saw true determination in his eyes. The entity screamed, a sound so primal and raw that it drove me to my knees. It was a sound that tore through my mind, shaking every fiber of my being. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move, paralyzed by the weight of her presence. Henry remained standing. Holding the key tightly, he began reciting the final incantation. His voice grew louder, more commanding, rising above the entity's screams. The candle's flame flickered and danced wildly, responding to his words. The entity made her final move. She surged forward, her shadowy mass wrapping around Henry, trying to crush him. I saw his face contort with pain, but he didn't stop chanting. "Finish it, Alex!" he yelled, tossing the key toward me. "Seal her!" My hands shook as I caught the key. I stepped toward the glowing symbol on the floor, the one still faintly pulsing with red light. I could feel the darkness trying to stop me, pulling at my limbs, but I pressed on. "Seal her, Alex!" Henry shouted again, his voice echoing as though from another world. I inserted the key into an invisible lock that appeared before me, shimmering faintly in the air. Turning it required every ounce of strength I had left. And then, everything changed. The darkness let out one final, deafening scream. It was a sound of pure agony, rage, and despair. The candle's flame flared brightly for a moment before it extinguished. The house fell silent. I opened my eyes to find the entity gone. Henry lay on the floor, exhausted but alive. His face was pale, but there was relief in his eyes. "Is it over?" I asked, barely able to believe we had survived. Henry nodded slowly. "She's sealed. But remember, you must never return here. Not ever." At dawn, we left the house. Henry closed the door behind us, sealing it with the final symbol. As we walked away, I turned back for one last look. The windows were empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. "You're free now," Henry said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "But this place is no longer yours. Forget it." I nodded, though deep down, I knew I would never truly forget. We left the house, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could take a full breath. The air no longer felt heavy, and the world outside no longer seemed hostile. But the relief was fleeting. Deep down, I felt it. This wasn't truly over. Henry drove me to his house, where I finally showered and had a proper meal for the first time in weeks. But the calm was deceptive. Even in this safe place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "You're free, Alex," Henry said as we parted. "But remember, darkness always finds a way. If there's even a crack in your life, it will return." "What do you mean?" I asked, a chill creeping through me. "You survived, but she left her mark on you. You must stay strong. Don't let fear control you." His words stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Had I truly survived? Or was this just a reprieve from the inevitable? I returned to my apartment, far from the town, far from the house. I wanted to believe it was over. But that first night, something went terribly wrong. When I lay in bed, the room was quiet. Too quiet. It felt as though even the city outside had gone still. I closed my eyes, trying to fall asleep, but then I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible. A whisper. At first, I thought it might be the wind outside the window, or a neighbor's television. But the sound was close. Far too close. "Alex," the voice whispered, and my heart froze. I sat up in bed, my eyes wide. The room was empty, but I could feel her. The entity. She was here. "This can't be happening," I whispered, clutching my head in my hands. "We sealed you." But the voice continued, soft but insistent. It came from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the very air around me. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The next day, I decided to find Henry, but his house was empty. A neighbor told me he'd left town, and no one knew where he'd gone. The thought struck me, had Henry ever been real? Or was he part of the entity's game, tormenting me even now? I returned to my apartment, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Weeks passed, and things only got worse. The whispering followed me everywhere, at home, at work, even in crowded streets. Sometimes I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, but when I turned, nothing was there. One day, as I looked into the mirror, I saw something that froze me in place. Behind me stood a figure, dark, faceless, but unmistakable. It was her. I spun around, but the room was empty. Each night, the nightmares grew more vivid. In my dreams, I was back in the house. I heard her voice, saw her shadow, felt her cold touch. Over and over, she whispered, "You can't escape. You belong to me." I woke drenched in sweat, my heart racing, but the whispering didn't stop. It continued, even when I was awake. The breaking point came one evening when I heard a knock at the door. It was the same knock I'd heard that night at the house. My heart pounded as I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door. It was beating so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. When I opened the door, no one was there. But on the doorstep, written in white chalk, were the words, "I'm still here. I don't know how this will end. Maybe I'm losing my mind. Maybe the entity was never truly sealed, or perhaps she left a part of herself inside me. But I know one thing, this isn't over." Sometimes, I think about going back to that house. Facing her. Finishing what we started. Or maybe, she's already here with me. And I'm just waiting for her to take me completely.